Welcome to Sleepy Dark Past, the place where we pull back the heavy velvet curtains of history, not to see the heroes, but to find the monsters, and to ask if they were ever really monsters at all. Tonight, our journey takes us to the cold, fractured heart of 16th century Hungary. We are climbing the steep hill to Chaktice Castle. The fog is thick here. It clings to the stone, and the silence is broken only by the cry of a distant raven. We have come here looking for a woman, a name that has echoed through 4 centuries, a name that is whispered alongside Dracula, a name that has become synonymous with vanity, cruelty, and blood. Elizabeth Báthory, the Blood Countess. Close your eyes, picture the legend. You see a woman of incredible beauty and terrifying power, pacing the cold floors of her castle. She is looking into a mirror, and she sees a wrinkle, a sign of age, the one enemy she cannot defeat. The legend says a servant girl snags her hair. The Countess, in a rage, strikes the girl so hard that blood splashes onto her hand. Later, Elizabeth notices something. The skin where the girl's blood touched seems younger, smoother, more radiant. And an idea is born. A grotesque, horrific idea. If a drop of blood can do this, what could a bath of it do? This is the legend, the story of a noble woman who, in her desperate pact against time, tortured and murdered 650 virgin girls to bathe in their blood. It is the perfect horror story. It has vanity, sex, power, and the dark promise of eternal youth. But tonight, we are not here for the legend. We are here for the truth. And the truth is a far more complex and perhaps a far more human story. Was Elizabeth Báthory the most prolific female serial killer in history? A sadistic monster who preyed on the innocent? Or was she the victim of the most successful character assassination of all time? A brilliant, wealthy, and powerful woman who was systematically destroyed by the men who owed her money?
Tonight, we will put the legend on trial. We will sift through the evidence, the politics, and the whispers. We will separate the fact from the fiction. Now, let the sounds of your world fade. Let the comfort of your pillow cradle you. And let us journey back to the world of the Blood Countess. To understand the monster, we must first understand the woman. And to understand the woman, we must understand her family. Elizabeth Báthory was not born into obscurity. She was born in 1560 into the heart of Hungarian power, the Báthory family. This was not just any noble family. They were titans. They were one of the oldest, wealthiest, and most powerful Protestant families in royal Hungary. Her relatives were cardinals, princes of Transylvania, and prime ministers. Her cousin, Stefan Báthory, was King of Poland. Power ran in their blood, and perhaps something else. The family was known for its extremes: genius and cruelty, epilepsy and melancholy. They were brilliant, and they were, some whispered, decadent. Elizabeth was no exception. She was raised not as a delicate flower, but as an aristocrat. She was exceptionally intelligent. By her teenage years, she was fluent in Hungarian, Latin, German, and Greek. She was educated, precise, and groomed from birth to manage vast estates. She was also wealthy beyond imagination. At age 15, she was married to another titan of Hungary, Ferenc Nadasdy. This was a political and financial merger of staggering proportions. Her husband was known as the Black Knight of Hungary. He was a celebrated and feared national hero. His life was spent on the battlefield, fighting a brutal, endless war against the encroaching Ottoman Empire. While the Black Knight was away, who do you think ran the castles? Who managed the finances? Who governed the dozens of villages and thousands of serfs? Elizabeth did. For decades, she was the sole, uncontested ruler of a vast territory. She was the judge, the jury, and the administrator. She held the power of life and death over her servants. This was not unusual. This was the feudal system. And all around her, the world was violent. The 16th century in Hungary was not a peaceful time. It was a time of constant, brutal war. The Ottoman Turks were a permanent threat. Villages were burned. People were impaled. Violence was daily life. It was also a time of intense political and religious instability. Hungary was fractured. The Protestant Reformation had split the country. The Báthory family was Protestant. The Habsburg king and his court were Catholic. This is not a small detail. It is, perhaps, the most important detail of all.
So let us paint the picture. We have a woman. She is brilliant. She is fabulously wealthy. She is from a powerful Protestant family. She is running her own affairs, independent and in charge, in a world dominated by men, in a kingdom run by a Catholic king, who, it just so happens, owed her and her late husband an astronomical sum of money. Elizabeth Báthory was not just a countess. She was a creditor. She was a political rival. She was a threat. Ferenc Nadasdy, the Black Knight, died in 1604. Elizabeth was now 44 years old, a widow, and for the first time completely and totally in charge of her own fortune. She was one of the richest people in the kingdom, and it was then that the rumors began. They started as whispers, faint like smoke, Whispers from the villages surrounding her many castles, Chaktis, Sarvar, Bekov. Peasant girls, young girls sent to the castle to work as servants, were disappearing. At first, no one cared. A serf girl vanishes. It is a tragedy for her family, but for the state, it is nothing. The daughter of a peasant was property, just like her father, and Elizabeth owned them. But the whispers grew. They found a voice. A local Lutheran pastor, Istvan Magyari, began to speak out. He had heard stories from his parishioners, stories of girls taken and never seen again, stories of cruelty. He began to make complaints, first locally, then to the court. Still, nothing. Nothing happened. Years passed. The rumors grew darker. The number of missing girls grew larger. 10, 20, 50. The whispers finally reached the ears of a man who could not ignore them. Gurji Thorgio, the Palatine of Hungary. Thorgio was effectively the second most powerful man in the kingdom after the king himself. He was the highest judge, and he was a political contemporary and rival of the Báthory family. Thorgio began a quiet investigation around 1609. He collected statements. He listened to the rumors. But the tipping point, the moment the case exploded, was not about peasant girls. The rumors changed. Elizabeth, the whispers said, had run out of local peasant girls. She had begun to lure or kidnap the daughters of the gentry, the lower nobility. This was an existential threat to the social order. To kill a serf was a property dispute. To kill a noble was a crime against the crown. Suddenly, Thorgio had all the political capital he needed. The king, Matthias II, gave his official, if hesitant, approval. The investigation was no longer quiet. It was now a formal proceeding. Thorgio was ordered to get to the bottom of this. He had political reasons, he had financial reasons, the king's debt, and now he had a legal reason. On December 29th, 1610, Georgi Thurzo and a contingent of soldiers rode for Chaktis castle. They did not announce their arrival. They stormed the gates, expecting to find a monster. What they found would define Elizabeth Báthory's name forever. This is the heart of the darkness. This is where we leave the legend and enter the courtroom. The popular story says Thurzo burst into the castle and found Elizabeth Báthory literally bathing in a tub of blood, or that he found her at a banquet surrounded by the pale, dead bodies of girls. This is not what happened. Thurzo's own letters and the official records tell a different story. They found one girl dead, one girl dying, and another woman wounded. They also found several other girls imprisoned, locked away in the cells. It was horrifying. It was damning, but there was no bath of blood. Thurzo acted immediately. Elizabeth was placed under house arrest. Her inner circle of servants, the ones rumored to be her accomplices, were seized. They were Dorocha Sentes, a woman known as Dorka, Ilona Yo, the girl's nurse, Katalin Benitka, a castle laundress, and a dwarf known only as Fico. These four were taken to the town of Bitska, and there they were interrogated. We must use that word interrogated with caution. This was 1611. Interrogation meant torture. The rack, thumbscrews, branding. Their confessions were extracted under unimaginable pain, and what they said was horrific. Over the next few weeks, Thurzo's investigators collected over 300 witness testimonies. They spoke to villagers, former servants, priests, and nobles, and a portrait emerged. A portrait of systematic, sadistic, and obsessive cruelty. Let us be clear. In all 300 testimonies, in all the confessions of her inner circle, not one single person ever mentioned Elizabeth Báthory bathing in blood. The legend is absent from the evidence. So what was she accused of? The truth is almost worse. It is not the clean Gothic horror of a vampire. It is the grubby, intimate horror of a serial sadist. The witnesses described a house of horrors. They said Elizabeth would punish servant girls for the smallest infractions: a stray thread, a poorly cleaned room, a word spoken out of turn. The punishments were not simple beatings.
Katalin Benichka confessed that she and the others held girls down while Elizabeth stuck thick needles, pins, under their fingernails. Sometimes she would drive the needles all the way through their fingers. Dorka confessed that Elizabeth had a fascination with burning. She would heat pokers and keys and coins until they were red hot and press them onto the girl's flesh, their arms, their faces,
But after a
their
time,
chests.
there were too many.
Ilona
Began to
Yo
dispose of them in
testified
grain
that
sacks,
in the brutal
leaving them in
winter,
forests,
Elizabeth would
fields,
force girls
leaving them
to
in
stand
forests,
outside,
in
naked.
fields.
She would douse them in cold water
The sheer
until they
banality of
froze
the
to
evil
death,
is
like
chilling.
statues of
The
ice.
witnesses painted a
Fico,
picture of a
the
woman
dwarf,
obsessed
claimed
with
the
control,
Countess bit them.
driven by a
She would tear
furious,
chunks of flesh
unpredictable
from their
rage.
cheeks, their shoulders.
Driven by a
They
furious,
testified that this went on
rage.
for years, that many
Woman
girls
who took
did not
pleasure in
survive.
the pain.
They said that at first they buried them in secret, in the castle grounds, in unmarked graves. But after a time, there were too many. They
Another
began
witness,
to dispose
a
of
woman
them
named
in
Susanna,
grain sacks,
estimated
leaving
the
them
number
in
was closer
forests,
to
in
50.
fields. The sheer banality of the evil is chilling. The witnesses painted a picture of a woman obsessed with control, driven by a furious, unpredictable rage. A woman who took pleasure in the pain of those who were powerless before her. Dorka and Ilona Yo, under torture, gave a number. They said they had helped murder, quote, at least 37 girls. Another witness, a woman named Susanna, estimated the number was closer to 50. The number 650, that famous number, came from a single source, a servant at Sarvar Castle. She claimed she had seen a list in the Countess's own handwriting in a private book, a list of 650 names. This book was never found. So we are left with this, a mountain of testimony, hundreds of voices, all describing in sickening detail years of torture and murder. But there is a problem. The key confessions were obtained under torture. Can we trust them? And the other witnesses, were they telling the truth? Or were they encouraged? Were they threatened? Were they saying what Georgi Thurzo wanted to hear? This is the central mystery. Is this the record of a serial killer or the script of a political execution?
We are at the heart of the mystery. As the story shifts from brutal human testimony to the cold world of political maneuvering, it is a good moment to pause. If you are finding value in this deep historical dive and wish to support our journeys into the past, please consider subscribing to Sleepy Dark Past. We have many more complex truths to uncover together. Now, let us look
at the trial,
never was.
or rather,
With this
the
mountain
trial
of gruesome
that never
testimony and
was.
4 confessed accomplices,
With this
the next
mountain
step
of
was
gruesome
obvious.
testimony
Public trial.
and 4 confessed accomplices, the next step was obvious: a public trial. A trial where Elizabeth Báthory, Countess of Hungary, could be presented with the evidence. A trial where she could face her accusers. A trial where she could speak. That trial never happened. Elizabeth Báthory was never tried. She was never formally charged. She was never allowed to testify in her own defense. This is the single most suspicious part of the entire case. Why? Why would Georgie Thurzo, who had this overwhelming evidence, suddenly stop? The answer is politics and money.
Why would
A public trial would be a public disaster. First, it would be a scandal that would rock the kingdom. A woman of the high nobility, publicly tried for mass murder of peasants. It would destabilize everything. Second, there was the problem of the king. King Matthias II owed the Báthory estate a colossal sum of money, a debt so large it could bankrupt the crown. If Elizabeth were tried and convicted as a common criminal, her property would be forfeit to the crown. But her family, her children, her powerful cousins would sue, and the king would have to pay them that enormous debt. There was another way. A way to satisfy the demands for justice and make the debt disappear. Georgie Thurzo, the politician, found a solution. He convened a court, but it was not for Elizabeth. It was for her servants. In January 1611, just days after their arrest, Dorca, Ilona, and Fico were brought before a panel of judges. The testimonies were read, the confessions were confirmed, the verdict was immediate, the sentence was brutal. Dorca and Ilona, the 2 chief accomplices, had their fingers, the ones that held the girls, ripped from their hands with red-hot pincers. Then they were burned alive at the stake. Fico, the dwarf, deemed a lesser participant, was beheaded. His body was thrown onto the same fire. Catalin Benicia, who had given testimony but seemed less involved, was imprisoned for life. Justice was served for the servants. But what of the Countess? Thurzo wrote to the king, explaining his solution. Elizabeth Báthory would be punished, but she would be punished quietly, without a trial. She would be declared condemned by the word of the Palatine alone. Her punishment? Life imprisonment. Soldiers were sent to Chuktiche Castle. They went to Elizabeth's private chambers, and there they began to build a wall. They bricked up the doorways. They bricked up the windows. They left only a small slot, a hole in the stone, large enough to pass food and water. Elizabeth Báthory, the most powerful woman in Hungary, was entombed, walled up inside her own home, to be left to the darkness and to her memories until she died. Her lands, her castles, her vast, vast fortune, it was conveniently divided. Her children were given some, but a large portion was seized by the crown as payment for the king's troubles. The debt was erased. The scandal was contained. The powerful woman was silenced. It was a perfect solution. Elizabeth Báthory died in her stone prison 4 years later in 1614. And for 100 years, she was forgotten. She was a footnote, a local bogeyman, a story of a cruel countess who tortured her servants. The details were sordid, but they were human. The legend, the part we all know, the part with the blood, did not exist. It was born in 1729, over 100 years after her death. A Jesuit scholar named Laszlo Turoczy was writing a history of the region. He was the first person ever to print the story of Elizabeth Báthory, and he added a new detail. He wrote that the Countess was not just torturing girls. He wrote that she had bathed in their blood to preserve her beauty. Where did he get this? He claimed it was from oral histories, local legends. But there is a problem. Turoczy was a Catholic Jesuit scholar. The Báthory family was the most powerful Protestant family in Hungarian history.
In the 18th century, the Counter-Reformation was in full swing. Catholic writers had every reason to paint the old Protestant nobility as decadent, godless, and monstrous. What better way to smear a rival faith than to accuse its most famous matriarch of not just murder, but of literal vampirism? The story was perfect. It was sticky, and it spread. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, other writers picked it up. They embellished it. They added details, the mirror, the slap, the magic of the blood.
And it spread.
The number of victims grew from Zuzana's 50 to the servants' 650. Why 650? It was a bigger, more shocking number. By the time Bram Stoker was writing Dracula in the 1890s, the legend of the Blood Countess was fully formed. She had become the female Dracula, a monster, a vampire. The woman who was walled up for torture had been transformed by over a century of propaganda, folklore, and Gothic fiction into the woman who bathed in blood. The legend had consumed the history. So, here we are, in the 21st century, peering back into the fog. What is the verdict? Who was Elizabeth Báthory? Today, historians are fiercely divided. There are two main camps. The first camp believes she was guilty, guilty as hell. They argue that you cannot simply ignore 300 witnesses. Yes, the key confessions were tortured, but the other testimonies, the villagers, the priests, the dozens of former servants who described the same specific and bizarre forms of cruelty. They all matched the needles, the burning, the freezing. This camp argues that this is not a conspiracy. This is a pattern. This is the profile of a sadistic serial killer. They believe Elizabeth Báthory was a woman protected by her power, who after her husband's death descended into madness and depravity. They believe she did torture and kill perhaps dozens, if not hundreds of girls. The lack of a trial, that, they say, was simply professional courtesy. Turtho and the king sparing the family the shame of a public execution while still stopping the monster. Then there is the second camp. This camp believes Elizabeth Báthory was a victim. They believe she was framed. They argue that the entire investigation was a brilliant political setup orchestrated by Georgi Turtho on behalf of King Matthias II. The motive? Money and power.
Here they had a woman, a widow, who was too smart, too rich, and too independent. She held the king's debt over his head. She was a Protestant powerhouse in a newly Catholic world. She had to be removed. In this version of the story, Thorzo used the local rumors, which they argue were just gossip, as a pretext. He stormed the castle, he arrested the inner circle, and he tortured them until they said exactly what he needed them to say. He collected 300 witnesses by threatening or paying the local peasants. He created a file, a dossier of evidence so damning that he could use it as blackmail. He silenced Elizabeth by walling her up where she could never speak, never write, never defend herself. And then he and the king carved up her lands. It was a perfect political assassination. So which is it? Sadistic killer or framed widow? The truth, as it so often does, likely sleeps in the gray shadows between the two. Perhaps Elizabeth was cruel. Perhaps in a time of casual brutality, she did beat her servants. Perhaps some of them even died. And perhaps Georgi Turzo, a man who needed no excuse to seize power, saw this kernel of truth, this wisp of smoke, and he fanned it into a raging inferno. He magnified her cruelty, he manufactured a conspiracy, and he used it to burn her to the ground. We will never truly know.
And he fanned it into a raging
The stone walls of Chachtice Castle are ruins now. The wind whistles through the empty chambers where Elizabeth Báthory spent her last 4 years staring into the darkness. But her shadow has never left us. It is fascinating that the crime she was actually accused of, systematic human torture, has been forgotten, and the crime she never committed, the fantastical Gothic crime of bathing in blood, is the one we all remember. Why? Perhaps because the legend is more comforting. A woman who bathes in blood is a vampire. She is a monster. She is other. She is not one of us. But a woman, a highly intelligent, educated and powerful woman who finds pleasure in methodically, slowly hurting those who are weaker than her. A woman driven by rage or boredom or a cold human sadism. That is not a monster. That is a human being, and that is terrifying. The legend of the Blood Countess endures, not because it tells a story of a vampire, but because it whispers a dark truth about ourselves, about our fear of aging, our obsession with beauty, and the horrifying, simple, and all too human cruelties that we are capable of when we have absolute power. Was Elizabeth Báthory a sadistic serial killer, or the victim of a political conspiracy? What do you believe is the truth? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Good night. Let the whispers fade to silence. Let the past whisper you to sleep.